Okay, time to get an overview of what is happening in the world and the world of travel. And as ever, the fortunes of the latter are very much intertwined with the former. Now, we're going to hear how travel and tourism can be a force for peace and progress as the day progresses. But let's hear first about the 10 forces reshaping global business today. And will Europe step up? And to deliver that presentation, can I please welcome to the stage Thomas Gratowski, MA, Director of the Center of Geopolitics for the Boston Consulting Group. Thomas.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. It's a true pleasure to talk about geopolitics on the day of a very important meeting on the other side of the world in South Korea, where Presidents Trump and Xi just talked this morning about stabilizing the most important relationship of the world that affects everyone, including us here in the room today. And so it's a true pleasure to discuss with you some of the geopolitical forces that are really shaping the business world today. At the Boston Consulting Group, we talk to hundreds of business leaders, of boards, about what are the issues really shaping operations across borders. What are the driving forces affecting their business? I will not go into all of them today, because I think we only have half an hour and not 3 hours. But I think for you to understand our thinking, where the world goes, I just want to highlight a few things. Number one, if you look at the first line, I think it's really important to note that the world is increasingly multipolar. It's not anymore a world where one power, perhaps the United States, or two powers, maybe the United States or the Soviet Union, or the United States and China alone, are able to shape the global business environment. No, it's a multitude of countries that need to be taken account of in global business today. Now, number two is multipolarity is a bit of a challenge, if you will, because it's a much less stable global environment than perhaps we were used to be. And so what we see is the emergence of what we would call economic battlegrounds, where great powers are increasingly competing for leadership, for influence, and for control over key strategic value chains. And lastly, a world of multipolarity also means that a world is much more exposed to shocks. Perhaps the ability to cooperate across borders, as perhaps it was during a unipolar moment when the United States was the dominant actor. The world we're entering is one that is much bumpier, much more at risk of global crises and conflicts. Now, I want to get into a few of those that I think are really the important drivers at the moment. And of course, I couldn't start here without mentioning what's going on in the United States. I think it has been breathtaking at the rate at which the United States, led by President Trump, has sought to change the global economic order. If you look at tariffs, the preferred tool of the Trump administration, we have seen that tariffs have been increased at a pace that we have not seen, and to a level that we have not seen basically since the end of the Second World War. Tariffs are now about 18% of all US imports. It was about 2.4% just at the beginning of the year. So it's a massive, massive change. And what is important is that tariffs are not only a tool for economic policy by the United States, they're also being used as a tool for geopolitical goals, such as economic security, influence, and control over key industries. Now, also importantly, tariffs will have cost. Cost for businesses, for consumers, around the world. We looked at the top 10 trading partners of the United States, and we calculated that for those alone, the cost of the tariffs is more than $400 billion. That's roughly the size of the South African economy, which is that what consumers and businesses will have to, in one way or another, absorb. Can you not? Okay, sorry, I thought it was on. Okay. So I think that's really important. I think a last point to that. I think the United States as a destination for people to work, to travel, has really taken a hit in terms of its reputation. What we have seen, and I think America First policy in trade, coupled with America First policy in immigration, has really led to changing attitudes towards the United States as a destination, as we have seen over the last several months. Now, the United States is obviously an important market, but as I said, just from the meeting today, China matters tremendously. And if we look at what China has done over the last 5 to 10 years, it has tried to become a much more self-reliant, much more confident global player. It has really focused on innovation, on key strategic manufacturing sectors, and has tried to make itself much less dependent on Western countries. I think one important aspect to that is that whatever happens in China, whatever happens in the US-China relationship, has an impact on us in Europe. And one of the critical areas where we can see that very clearly is China's control of the value chains of critical minerals. Now, this might sound far away for the travel industry, but I think it's actually tremendously important, because China has developed a lever over the European economy that can really affect large segments of European production and European services industries. Now, the deal this morning seems to suggest that there might be some stabilization, but I think it's still important for us in Europe to understand what happens in China and in the US-China relationship really matters to us. Now, my third point, and here I want to talk about the Global South. The world is not only the large major economies in Europe, the United States, and in China. Actually, the world around Europe is changing tremendously. And it's not always driven by geopolitics, but also by demographics, by economics, and other factors. To give you one idea, at the beginning of the century, global economic growth largely came from what we would say are Western nations in North America, Europe, and Asia, like Japan and Korea. Now, fast forward to 2030, by then, 50% of global economic growth will come from the Global South. When Europe contributed around 22% to global economic growth at the beginning of the century, by the end of this decade, it will be India. So we have seen a dramatic change in how the rest of the world develops in terms of its economic size. And it's important also to note that China, over the last several years, has really become one of the key, actually, partners of many Global South economies. About 10 years ago, it was the largest trading partner for about 30 countries. Now it's the largest trading partner for more than 60. European companies are actually increasingly under pressure. So it's incredibly important to think what role Europe can play in its engagement with the Global South. Now, I think Europe has had quite a moment of reckoning this year. I think the continent perhaps was in one of the weakest economic spots it has ever been in decades. There was a prospect that the US and Russia would impose a security architecture on Europe. The European economy is obviously still struggling, and political fragmentation in Europe, be it in France, but also in my home country of Germany, where for almost the first half of the year we didn't have a government in place. Obviously, that is holding back Europe. Now, we looked at some of the trade deals that Europe has, or the trade deal that Europe has struck with the United States, and the agreement that Europe has struck in NATO to increase the defense target to 5% over 10 years. Many of them have been criticized. I would maybe say that they have been important, but they have been important in buying Europe time to get its house in order. Unfortunately, I need to say that Europe hasn't done enough so far. If you look at an important report that has become, if you will, the economic program of the European Commission, a report drafted by Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB. We looked at that report and at its key indicators to see how much progress has Europe made. And unfortunately, we came to the conclusion that in 10 out of 17 of those indicators, Europe has fallen further behind. We have lost market share in export markets for goods and for services. Europe has become more dependent on China for critical minerals. Europe has not been able to get its industry back on a path towards growth. So it's really a picture where Europe needs to step up. Now, one area perhaps where we have seen most progress in Europe is defense. Now, you might wonder, why is it important for travel and tourism? I think one aspect is particularly important. If you look at what the plan is from today until 2029 for European defense budgets, you will see that by 2029, they will account for roughly the size of the US military budget today. A massive change. So perhaps a question that I would pose into the room. A more confident Europe, I think, is certainly an advantage. A Europe that is able to take care of its own security. What does it mean for Europe's image in the world? I hope Europe can use that in a way that really helps build its partnership and perhaps not become seen as a force that is perhaps seen as detrimental in some global affairs. Now, I talked about some economic partnerships already. The United States is obviously very important. We've seen that trade deal that stabilizes relations with the United States. But the United States is not the world. Actually, 85% of global trade takes place outside of the United States. We looked at some of the, we made our own forecasts, actually, of where European growth will grow over the next 10 years. And you will see that actually the biggest export markets will be, or the growth we'll see, will be biggest with countries like India, Mercosur, ASEAN, and others. And so it's a real positive, I think, that Europe has actually not stood still when it comes to its trade position. Over the last 10 or so months, Europe has struck a trade deal with Mercosur in South America, has struck a trade deal with Indonesia, and is about to finalize a trade deal with India, which means in about 12 months, Europe has opened the market to 2 billion consumers if those deals get implemented. That should be a platform, really, for Europe to rebuild and to deepen relationships with countries outside of the United States, outside of its traditional markets, perhaps, to seize growth opportunities that are growing in other parts of the world. Now, trade, you always think about goods trade, but actually, and I really want to emphasize this, services trade is actually the much more important driver of trade and growth in trade over the next decade. And travel is the #1 driver, or travel and transport, the #1 segment of global services trade. So we looked at, how services trade grew in the past, how it will grow over the next 10 years. And actually what you will see is that it will accelerate, #1, and #2, it will grow at roughly the double the pace that goods trade will grow. So really the opportunities are large. Travel and transport is expected to grow by around 4% over the next decade. Now, I quickly want to touch on technology, because I think technology is also an important part, actually, of the rise of cross-border services trade. Of course, at the moment, we have two, if you will, AI superpowers. It's the United States and it's China. But I believe Europe can play an important role as what we would say is an AI middle power if Europe really manages to use the size of its market, to use the strength of its 27 member states, to collaborate and to get its strength in a certain amount of critical AI technologies. Now, the other good thing is, it's not only about developing the technology of AI. I think increasingly it's about AI adoption. And Europe and European services industry in particular can benefit tremendously from making sure that it keeps pace and maybe is faster than many other parts of the world in adopting AI. Now, of course, we couldn't talk about geopolitics without talking about some of the conflicts in the world. I think what we have seen over the last 12 months and years is really a rise in conflict, including in interstate conflict. Maybe surprisingly, the United States under President Trump has been actually more active than many thought in trying to manage some of those conflicts. But the Ukraine conflict hasn't been resolved, and our outlook is that it won't be anytime soon, unfortunately. The Gaza conflict has perhaps been put into an icebox for now, and we'll see what happens, but it remains fragile. But nonetheless, there is hope that some of those conflicts can be resolved and can actually lead to new partnerships, including in the Middle East, where we have seen actually very significant changes. Of course, for the travel industry, it will matter a lot, not only where conflicts take place, but also what perceptions of people are about the safety of different locations around the world. And lastly, just to make a last quick point, which I think is really relevant in Europe, what we have seen is an increasing polarization within our countries. Polarization that is driven by a sentiment that our economies are struggling, that our institutions aren't working. And so I think the travel and tourism industry has a real role to play as a driver of growth in also making sure that our political and economic coherence within Europe stays strong. Now, just a couple of quick thoughts on what that means for international business. I think it's really important for international business to really think about how actually does geopolitical factors affect my corporate strategy and to incorporate those into corporate strategy. Thinking about the next growth opportunities, thinking about new partnerships, and thinking about what role technology can play in that. And with this, I will thank you very much for the opportunity.